So we'll finish our first unit with what I call an emerging colonial unity. As the American story progresses towards the American Revolution, we're going to see Americans start to come together in many ways, but there will always be things that remain divisive in American society, whether it's race, ethnicity, religious belief, social standing. We'll briefly look at the colonial economy, a religious revival known as the Great Awakening, and the French and Indian War as we finish laying the groundwork for the American Revolution. Let's start with mercantilism. Mercantilism describes how colonial economies operated. It's all about maintaining a favorable trade balance. Countries wanted to be exporting more than they were importing. The more wealth a country possessed, the more power it had. This explains why Europeans initially spent so much time and energy looking for gold before turning their attention to cash crops and the search for natural resources. The role of colonies in this system is to provide cheap natural resources and markets to the mother country. So New England might export lumber to England to be turned into finished products that were then sold back to the colonies. The goal for countries like England, France, and Spain in this mercantile system is to create powerful, prosperous, self-sufficient nation states. They don't want to have to depend on each other for anything. And ultimately, they want to increase their own power both in Europe and in the world. In order to see what this mercantilism looks like in the English colonies, we'll look at the Navigation Acts, which are a series of laws passed by the Parliament in the middle part of the 17th century. And what these acts did was, it basically said that countries like Portugal or Spain could not directly trade with the colonies. It says that all goods coming from other European countries had to go to Great Britain first, who would then turn around and sell the goods in the North American colonies. What this does is it allows the British to put a tax on its goods. The law also said that certain colonial goods could only be sold to England, things like tobacco, rice, sugar, and lumber. These were the most profitable colonial goods, and this way it allowed Britain to basically have a monopoly on this part of the colonial trade. One last thing that these acts did was they prevented the colonists from producing any manufactured goods that might compete with English products. Basically, England did not want to have to compete against goods made in its own colonies. So if we assess the Navigation Acts from the colonial perspective, the positives, they're going to get a lot of military aid from the British to basically protect their trade interests. The colonists are going to have a guaranteed market for their goods, especially cash crops that are grown. And also, New England shipbuilders will benefit from this economy that's basically based on global trade. So you're going to see a lot of the lumbering and shipbuilding in New England is really going to boom during this time period. In the flip side of the Navigation Acts, we're going to see a very slow colonial manufacturing sector. American manufacturing will be very slow to take off. As more and more cash crops are produced, the prices are going to go down, which means that Southern farmers are going to have heavy debts to English merchants. And then lastly, these writs of assistance, and what that is basically is, British officials give themselves the right to search colonial ships without reason. There is a lot of smuggling going on at the time, and colonists start to view this as a violation of their rights. We're going to start to, this is going to become a much bigger deal as we get closer and closer to the American Revolution. The institution of slavery is very important to the development of America during the colonial period. And I've talked about how the first African slaves arrive at Jamestown in 1619 by way of Dutch slave ships. Slaves from West Africa were brought to the Caribbean and North America through the Middle Passage, where slaves were packed below deck in coffin-sized areas where they're forced to deal with sickness and death as they are crossing the Atlantic Ocean, a voyage that could take 3 weeks to 3 months. And upon arriving in the Western Hemisphere, Africans would be sold into captivity, which for most of these individuals, it becomes a life sentence. As the colonies grew, the need for slaves increased. South Carolina emerges as a major location for slave auctions in the colonies. Slavery grows very quickly in the South, but it's not just a Southern practice. There are slaves throughout colonial America, but as you can see the statistic there, 1690 there were 13,000 slaves. By 1750 there were 200,000, and that number will just continue to grow. Around the age of 12, a slave will become a full-time worker which for most, this is what they will do for the rest of their life. Very few slaves, especially early on, will, be freed. Entire families are enslaved. Children of slaves are viewed as commodities to be sold or traded, or a future source of labor. Slaves face cruelty at the hands of overbearing masters and overseers. And this institution of slavery will be a continual dividing force in American history, and something we're going to come back to throughout the first half of the year. All right, so let's shift gears and talk about religion for a minute. The Great Awakening is a mid-17th century movement that impacts religion in Europe and the American colonies. What it is basically is a challenge to the established churches of the time period, the Anglican Church in the southern colonies, the Congregationalist Church in New England. And what people like Jonathan Edwards and his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and George Whitefield want to do is, they want to make church more inclusive. They want to make church a more exciting experience, and they want to make it more emotional. They don't want the same dry procedural, sermons that people have heard for a long time, which have caused people to turn away from the church. All right, let us consider the impacts of the Great Awakening. We start to see an increase in religious enthusiasm. We start to see a spread of religion to peoples who didn't have access to religion before. We start to see rapid growth of different religious options, right? Evangelical groups like Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians that challenge the established church and governmental order of the day, right? Congregationalists in New England have been running the show for a very long time. Different religious sects will create, different colleges. The College of New Jersey, we know, is Princeton today. The College of Rhode Island, now Brown. Queens College today is Rutgers. The College of Philadelphia, now known as Penn. These were all started by different religious groups. And one last thing to think about when we talk about, this idea of religion, right, and the Great Awakening really lays the foundation for a lot of the ideas we see in the American Revolution and in the writing of our Constitution, right, like the First Amendment and the freedom of religion, right, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. And it's still an important idea in American history even after the Great Awakening. So the last thing we'll talk about will be the French and Indian War. Let's make sure we understand who's fighting. It's the French and its Native American allies against the British and the American colonies. It is not the French fighting the Indians, as the name might lead you to believe. Let's make sure we understand the landscape of America during this time period. Right, France owns a lot of territory, in west of the Appalachian Mountains, west of the Mississippi River, and the British, of course, have the 13 colonies, and they also have land up in Canada. What they're fighting over, though, is the Ohio River Valley. This is a disputed area between these two European rivals, and the war will be fought between 1754 and 1763. All right, just a few things we should know about the French and Indian War. George Washington's military career starts in this conflict. Washington had always wanted to earn a commission as a British officer. This would be something that will not happen. In the war, his record is not stellar. He'll be defeated by a superior French force at Fort Duquesne. But he will learn valuable lessons in military command, tactics, leadership, and maybe most importantly, he'll learn a lot about how the British Army operates. At the beginning of the war, Benjamin Franklin will suggest a plan of union that comes to be known as the Albany Plan. What this plan does is it's designed to raise money and troops and also regulate trade. The British and colonial governments at the time will reject it as a result of their fear of a strong centralized government in the colony. But what Franklin's idea does is it provides a plan of unity for the colonies that they would be able to use during the American Revolution. Just one last thing is this image that I think most people associate with the American Revolution is actually drawn by Benjamin Franklin during the French and Indian War. And Franklin's message is pretty clear, right? The snake or the colonies, will be much stronger when they are united rather than, chopped up or divided. So the French will be defeated in 1763, and the English will be able to negotiate a very favorable peace for themselves through the Treaty of Paris in that same year. The French will give up all its North American colonies, with Canada and all land east of the Mississippi River, going to the British. All land west of the Mississippi River will go to Spain. And you can see on the map there that Florida will switch from Spanish control in 1754 to British control in 1763. The French are very bitter after this, and they're going to look for an opportunity for revenge, which they will get during the American Revolution when they help the colonies against the British. So a few impacts of the war. England will solidify its position as the dominant colonial power. As France is kicked out of North America, it surrenders a lot of territory. England will issue the Proclamation of 1763, which you can see there is basically a line they draw, and they tell the colonists, you cannot settle west of this area. This does not sit well with the colonists who want to take advantage of this new land. Basically, the English don't want to have to pay to protect the colonists from the native tribes that exist in this area. And the English need to pay for the war. And what we're going to see is increased taxation of the colonies in the period immediately following the war. Let's close the show by considering the French and Indian War as the turning point in the relationship between England and its American colonies. For England, the war increases its colonial possessions. We talked in the beginning about mercantilism and how colonies help countries generate wealth. England's debt will double as a result of the war, forcing them to seek revenue from its colonies. England will also station 10,000 troops in North America to protect its territory. This will be a source of conflict between the two sides going forward. And ultimately, we will see the relationship break apart as the British grow tired of colonial complaints and grievances. For the colonies, the war unites them against a common enemy for the first time. They actually feel like Englishmen at the war's conclusion. This is a feeling that actual Englishmen will not share with them. They do not like the Proclamation of 1763. This is something they'll basically disregard, as they want access to the land that they believe that they played a major role in securing. And finally, they will grow to resent the British because of new taxes. This is something we'll talk about in our next unit. The presence of British troops and things like the Proclamation of 1763. Colonists had grown accustomed to running their own affairs up to this point. Thus, resentment will grow over time, and the groundwork for revolution will be laid. We will start our look at the American Revolution next time, and until then, good night, Albuquerque.